Michigan basketball led Nebraska for about 2 full minutes on Tuesday, and yet it managed to win. Let's break it down right here on this episode of Locked On Wolverines.
You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Wednesday. We're back and doing it. Locked On Wolverines podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network. I'm your man on the ground, Isaiah Holt, publisher of Wolverines Wire through USA Today Sports Media Group. Thank you to all of our everydayers who watch or listen to the show every single day. Also, big thank you for making us your first listen. First, we'll discuss the 75-72 win over Nebraska for the Michigan basketball team. Then we're going to get into some of Carrie Coombs' comments about special teams finally. I don't claim to be an insider, but what does it take to become one? Just so you kind of have an idea of what that's all about. All right, let's get into the Michigan basketball of it all. It was an interesting game in multiple ways. Obviously, the first half was a scoring bonanza for both teams. It was interesting. Michigan took the 3-2 lead with about 80 seconds into the game, and then it didn't last very long. They didn't reclaim the lead until minute 7 left. But it was just, of course, I want to acknowledge Nebraska without 2 of its top scorers, but that kind of weirdly, I think, played into their hands. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but, you know, having a different type of lineup, not and everything, like, yeah, maybe they end up winning if they have them, or maybe it ends up being an easier task for a better scouted team. But no one really set the world on fire for the Wolverines. Morez Johnson Jr. had 17 points. That was about as good as that was going to get here. And Yaks, not his best game by any stretch, nor was it for Elliot Cadeau. Both of them, you know, Yaks 3 for 10, Elliot Cadeau 2 for 9. Cadeau, at least he hit 2 of those were 3-pointers. But Yaks was 0 for 6. Several of them halfway down, rimming back out. The difference, obviously, is that you look at Price Sandfort, went 5 for 16 from 3. In the early going, it was like he couldn't miss. Like some of his shots looked insane and wild, and yet they were going down. Jamarcus Lawrence went 4 from 9 from 3. The big thing that changed in this game, certainly, was they went. I got to look this up real quick. They went 10 of 19, Nebraska did, from 3 in the first half. And the second, 1 for 13. They went from not being able to miss to not being able to hit. And that gave Michigan an opportunity to get back into it. I thought there was a lot of lazy passing and things of that nature. Michigan cannot, like I say this, but we said this going into the game, that they can't have a lot of turnovers if they're going to beat teams like Nebraska currently looks to be, now sitting at 20-1. Yet Michigan turned the ball over 19 times. Some of it was just completely, a lot of them were just completely like unjustifiable. Guys, slow down a little bit, right? Like there are just so many times where it was like, Cadeau, you do not need, and Cadeau had 8 of those turnovers. You don't need to be just lobbing it like across the court. I understand you're trying to get some quick scores, but like settle in a little bit. Michigan went 6-0 at the end of the game. Nebraska went 1 of its last 9. It was on a 3+ minute scoring drought. Trey McKenney had the big go ahead basket, and Ademara added the free throw. What's crazy is that you put the ball into the hands of some people here. Michigan did a lot better from its free throws than it had previously. 19 of 23. Ademara went 2 for 4. And that was needed, right? Like one of them was the 75 in the 75-72 score. So, some of those were just absolutely necessary that they needed to make. And about a week ago, I wouldn't have thought that would happen, right? They were shooting around 50-60%. It's funny how some of these problems persist team to team, new coaches, new rosters, and yet turnovers and free throws tend to continue to be Michigan's Achilles heel. And we've seen red hot shooting earlier in the year, and they didn't have that in this game. They did end up out shooting Nebraska 47.2%. They were shooting close to 60% in the first half, and then everything kind of came crashing down later. But the defense at least figured out how to handle a lot. And I think some of that was some of the Nebraska guys also getting in foul trouble. You had 3 guys with 4 fouls. Despite the fact that Michigan was out-fouled, I felt the refs really held onto the whistle a lot. The Chrysler Center crowd was really not feeling a lot of what was going on there. And I think it was really generally justified. There were some reaches that were petty that were called on Michigan, and the same thing happens on the other end. It doesn't get called, yet Nebraska got called. Trey McKenney said after the game, this was the most physical game he's played in. And obviously now all eyes are on Sparty, but this again was a good way to, just to not get that second loss, right? Like that would have been a little bit demoralizing going into the Michigan State game. And, considering they had their own struggles with Rutgers, I think it's good to be able to grit out a win like this. And when a lot's not going your way, right? Nebraska looked like the better team for most of it. And it's not that they looked like the better team. They looked like a team that was equal, that had a lot of shots that were able to fall, particularly in the first half where Michigan couldn't. Now, Michigan's biggest lead was what it ended the game in with 3 points. Nebraska had an 11-point lead at one point. So it's kind of crazy that they were able to do a lot of what they were able to do defensively. And Fred Hoiberg said after the game that the size really bothered them. And that's huge. Michigan going 6 for 26 from 3, like you're just 23%. Like generally they're not going to win a ton of games when they're shooting that low, but like they got the production where they needed it when they needed it. Trey McKenney's my player of the game here. I thought he was excellent the way he came in, hit 2 threes, had essentially the go ahead basket, doing it in contact. I agree with what Dusty May had to say after the game, that there was just a lot of, he didn't call it selfish basketball, but there were a lot of times where you saw like Yaks charge what looked to be 4 guys in the paint, right? Like, and Dusty said, like, I'd like to see more kickouts in moments like that. Yeah, like that felt a little bit different compared to what we are accustomed to seeing Michigan look like. Usually we don't see them trying to play hero ball. This is kind of more late in the game, so I don't think this was like an early game issue, but like I think they could have been more in the game earlier than they were if they just were playing a more of a Michigan basketball style that we're more accustomed to seeing this year. But I think the good news is like you got this out of your system. You've gone through the month that is. John Rothstein called this Michigan win by split decision. I love his consistent boxing references here. So it's just going to be really interesting to see what they're able to do on Friday night at the Breslin Center in East Lansing. I will not be there, and my colleagues are very envious. I'm going to cover that game from home. I don't feel like I need the post-game press conference quotes that bad. So anyhow, that's that. And we're going to transition back into football. Let's do that here in just a moment.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kalia Butler, host of Locked On Women's Basketball, and this is Mazda's Women's Basketball Snapshot, celebrating the work no highlight reel can ever capture. The WNBA has released its 2026 schedule, featuring a 44-game regular season beginning on Friday, May 8th. The league's historic 30th season includes expansion teams Portland Fire and the Toronto Tempo, with opening weekend highlights such as Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever hosting Paige Beckers and the Dallas Wings, and a rematch of the 2025 finals between the Aces and the Mercury. In college hoops, South Carolina handed Vanderbilt its first loss of the season with a dominant 103-74 win. These moments are earned off the clock, those long before the lights ever come on. The sweat, the fakes, the doubt, the scrapes, and coming back for more every time. Mazda puts the same drive into every detail. Wins define the moment. Putting in the work, that defines you. There's more to a Mazda because there's more to you.
Thank you for making Locked On Wolverines your first listen. I've got to tell you, if you want to level up and you're going to want to do this, you're going to want to become an everydayer, not just a listener everydayer, but you're going to want to join the Everydayer Club. That means you're going to get ad-free access, but most importantly, you're going to get that private Discord server where you can ask me anything. I'm going to spill the beans. I'm going to tell you a lot more than I should be. But it's a great deal, right? And so far, everyone seems to be loving it. Obviously, it's a great place also to meet up with fellow like-minded Locked On Wolverines listeners and get the conversation really going. And actually, segment 3 is inspired from the Everydayer Club today. So there you go. It's $5 a month or $50 for the year. So you're going to want to sign up. So go to lockedonwolverines.supercast.com or check the show notes to learn more. All right. I got to read you this Carrie Coombs quote because it is highly, highly interesting. And I think it tells you a lot about where Michigan special teams were the last 2 years and why it looks so much better. So, all right, here we go. He said this. He said, well, I think the thing was that they had struggled and they knew they had struggled. There were some things that were easy for me to see. Haven't done this for quite a while. The meetings were too long. The time on the field relative to special teams, frankly, was too long. There's not a single kid that came to the University of Michigan to play right guard on punt. And if you don't make it exciting, you don't make it interesting, you don't keep it pretty brief, you're going to lose them. And they're not going to want to play. They're not going to want to perform. They'll do it because they're part of the team, but you got to get them excited about doing it. And that's one of the big challenges of special teams. And we kind of revamped how meetings were being run and how we were doing things. We changed schemes, which I thought it was important to do. Because just doing the same things wasn't going to work. We kept some things everything wasn't bad, but for the most part, and my philosophy has always been the schemes need to be simple and you need to rely on fundamentals, technique, and effort. And that's what we did. Made it very simple for the bowl game, and the kids kind of latched onto it and played so hard. They practiced hard, they embraced it. And even in the midst of all that chaos, sure, more stuff. If you're a young person, well, for me, it was chaotic, but at least I've been around the bend a time or two. For those kids, it was something else. And for them to be able to focus on the particulars in special teams was remarkable to me. I'm really pleased with how they played. So, dysfunction just kind of ran rampant through a lot of what Michigan was doing. And it definitely was running rampant through special teams, which were I don't mean to pile on to JB Brown, but just an absolute debacle for 2 years. For coming from it being maybe the best special teams unit for, not just 3 years, but for the majority of Jim Harbaugh's tenure, the fact that it was it wasn't even that it wasn't thought of, right? Because JB Brown was a full-time special teams coach. You generally don't have those across college football. I would venture to, kind of guesstimating here, but generally you don't have that. But I think that there's some indictments here. The meetings were too long. The time on the field relative special teams, frankly, was too long. And the fact that there was a lack of interest, there was a lack of pride. And the fact that all it really took was simplifying it. And suddenly it's better. That game was such an indictment on what was going on for 2 years. And that's kind of part and parcel of the adults being in the room. I know there's a lot of people that looked at the Carrie Coombs of it all and said, well, he didn't do great with special teams at Cincinnati. People were saying that even after they saw the Texas game. And I think well, the proof is in the pudding here. Hate using idioms like that, but still. And you saw just how effective it ended up being. And he said well, we didn't do cover one punt very well. And they had an All-American punt returner back there and we had a penalty and blah, blah, blah. But otherwise, they actually returned kicks and punts. They, and they got positive yardage doing it. They got a turnover. These are things that you could see. And it was these were all positive scenarios. These were all things that ended up really working out in their advantage. And that's before even getting the other adults in the room, Kyle Whittingham and his staff, right? He was hired on a Friday with Sharon Moore being fired less than a week later. And thankfully for him, he gets to stick around. But that just goes to show what the difference is between having coaches who actually know what they're doing versus having coaches that have no idea. And it's kind of so I was on Crane and Cone on 3 earlier today. And I was talking about just the difference between having, having backup quarterbacks and having Coy Detmer Jr. I mean, yes, Michigan did have a guy in Josh Sinagoga that was overseeing. I'm not trying to rip on Josh here either, but like you've seen Devin Dampier and what he was able to do at New Mexico and at under Jason Beckett, as well as at Utah. You've seen Utah quarterbacks tend to be pretty good. Cam Rising, who's just was always injured, but like he's, you know, they've tended to have very good quarterbacks over the course of Kyle Whittingham's tenure. And so just to like have competent people that take a look at the landscape and say, we need competition, because it's not just about having a safety net. It's about having someone who can push the person in front of them to make them better. Because if there's no safety net there, essentially, like there's no incentive to necessarily like, yeah, you might have like a internal drive like Bryce does, but like, it isn't a, man, I'm going to lose my job if I don't do well, right? Like, I don't think Bryce will lose his job, but I think the threat of it mixed with Coy Detmer Jr., I think is going to be really big. Much like I think that when you look at special teams and just having competent adults in the room, how much that changes things. Michigan is, don't let anybody or anything fool you. It's a very talented team, as much as rivals might to try to pretend like, oh, it's an also-ran type of team. No, it's a very, very talented team. And we've seen Jim Harbaugh get out in the 3-year run a lot of production out of that talent. Not all the talent was 5 stars, right? Like Zach Zinder was a 3-star. Trevor Keegan was a 4-star, but I mean, like those two guys were two of the best to ever do it in an amazing blue uniform. And Kyle Whittingham's going to be playing with a heck of a lot more house money than he's been playing with before. So, you know, if someone already has shown that they are a skilled blackjack player and you take them from the low stakes table to the high stakes table, as long as they continue to do the things that allowed them to win when they were at the low stakes table, that should pay off at the high stakes table. Now, the house always wins, so that's maybe not the greatest analogy in the world. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot to really like about having a Carrie Coombs that suddenly turns a unit around overnight, that can sit there and say, what is this? This is ridiculous. And there's not a good buy-in here, and we need one. So let's do what we can to simplify things, make it so these guys can play hard, play right. And suddenly we're doing, you know, it's like, I felt like too often Sharon Moore was so attached to the Jim Harbaugh of it all. It was like, well, we've got to always be using calculus, when sometimes like you got to be able to master algebra before you can do calculus. Not sometimes, all of the time. You're not going to be able to do calculus or without being able to do geometry and trigonometry. And yet they're asking people in algebra half to be able to do calculus. And that kind of goes across the team in a lot of ways. And I just feel like you're not necessarily going to see that with this coaching staff. And you've already seen that one unit can be that much improved. Imagine the rest. And just by virtue of having, you know, less stodgy minds that say, this is how we do things, you know, like I do think there's an element of that, but I think that's more cultural than I think it is schematic. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see. All right, let's get into, there was a question. I'm sorry, I can't attribute it offhand, but someone asked me, what does it take? I think it was Ramez Herrick asked me, like, how does one become an insider? Again, I don't claim to be one. I sometimes have inside info, but I definitely do not have all of the inside info. So we're going to get to that, and we're going to do so here in just a moment. But before we do, there's nothing like being in an NBA arena. The crowd, the energy, the moment. Getting tickets, though, that part hasn't always been so simple. That's why GameTime has become the go-to app for scoring tickets fast without the hassle. It puts the advantage back where it belongs, with the fans. I pulled up the GameTime app, picked an upcoming NBA game, and had tickets locked in within minutes. I love seeing the all-in price up front, no surprise fees at checkout. Being able to see the view from the seat before buying makes the decision so easy. And zone deals, those stand out in a big, big way. You choose the section, GameTime picks the seats, and you save big. With great last-minute options too, the NBA tickets showing up at solid prices, and everything just feels quick, intuitive, and stress-free from start to finish. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the GameTime app today. And remember, it's gametime.co, not .com. All right, we're going to continue here momentarily, but before we do, It's the last call on football for FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff, the final chance to get in on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing your favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same game parlay, this is the game that everyone has been waiting for. This is where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap feels bigger. It's the perfect way to cap off the season and make the Super Bowl even more exciting from kickoff to final whistle. If you're a new customer, bet just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. Make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the season's over. Last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, what does it take to become an insider? Because a lot of people want to know what it's all about, and I think everyone does it in different ways. But it's essentially, it depends on what kind of job you've had. It's essentially networking in some way or some form, right? And so I came from Hollywood, where, they say I don't have a drinking problem, I have a networking problem. that sometimes holds a little too close to the truth, for not just for me, but also others. But certainly that's kind of what it is. And I mean, you have to provide some level of value, I think, if you're to be an insider. And the way that these things kind of work, this isn't like a nebulous thing. And, people always ask oh, how do you know what's going on with this? And what's going on with this? And right now I can say I don't know, because I don't have a ton of people inside the building at the moment, because it's a new staff. It's not entirely new, but it's generally new. But generally you have to provide some kind of value, because otherwise what's the point in sharing information or trading information, right? So ultimately, for me, the way it started back in 15-16 was I was on the field. So I still am on the field, but I was often sending players and coaches and people pictures. And that can lead to, a burgeoning relationship. And sometimes because of that, people would tell you things hey, you got any pictures? Yeah, here you go. And, then maybe you ask a question and they answer. It can be trading information, right? That's another big thing, right? If I'm handling something recruiting wise, or I'm scouting an opponent and I notice something that maybe is off the radar, it's not going to be on the, on the scouting report or something like that. And I'm just using generalities here, because, of course, we're not trying to burn any bridges beyond what we do sometimes, but that's generally it. Is so for recruiting is kind of the big one, and it's kind of a gateway to being an insider in a lot of ways. And I've had colleagues ask me from time to time of how can I get more inside information? And it's well, are you covering recruiting? Note that I don't cover a lot of recruiting anymore, because like I said, I'm not trying to be an insider. And sometimes you want to try to get as much information from coaches and recruits and things like that of that nature. Now it's a little different with NIL. The teams can get a little bit more involved in ways that they hadn't before, because they can put out offers and things of that nature that are, they can actually beat a team with, and obviously teams were down south were doing that as it was, but now, things are kind of evened out and leveled out in ways that they weren't before. But I kind of learned that lesson somewhat early, even just because before I was officially hired by 24/7 Sports, they flew me down to San Antonio for the Army All-American game that year. And no one was asking Devin Asiasi about Michigan. Everyone just assumed it was another school. And Steve Lorenz was like, hey, can you interview Devin after the game? Because I feel like Michigan's got a shot here. No one has asked him once about Michigan. And I did. I didn't even know what intel I had. And I sent it, I got it. I sent it to Steve, and he's like, oh man, that's huge. And then I got Devin on the phone a couple weeks later. I didn't have I'd lost or something happened with my recorder, so I wasn't able to record it. So I had to just kind of go off of memory, and whatever he told me, which felt to me, just listening to it felt like very like a mundane recruiting call. It prompted Steve to put in a crystal ball pick for Asiasi to Michigan, and ultimately he ended up committing to Michigan. I think that's I inadvertently broke that he was visiting, right? Like these were kind of early recruiting conversations, but like I had gotten some intel, and some people were able to parlay that into things that can help get more inside information. And the more that you're able to kind of provide some value in that sense, the more that someone's going to be able to look at you and say, I've got to tell you this. Like, I think it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it's just friendship, right? Like that was it for me with Connor. How did I come to become close with Connor? Well, because he and I knew each other already just from virtue of being on the sidelines, me being on the sidelines and all of that. He was around well before 2021, even though, rival fans want you to believe that it all started, well, what changed? Like, well, he was around back then too. He's been around as long as I had been. And we both had a flight down to the Citrus Bowl in 2019. Our flight was delayed. We just stood in the Evans terminal at that time, North Terminal at DTW, and talked for hours. So a lot of stuff came up. Now, not all things end up being right. I'm not talking about that conversation, but there's plenty of times that I've had, like I've said before, there've been times where a player might have led me astray. There's times that a coach might have led me astray. Might be time that a parent has led me astray. I'm thinking about all of these things, of examples of exactly what happened. Sometimes it's because things change. Sometimes it's because they're obfuscating. Sometimes it's they want a narrative out and it doesn't, and I can't tell you whether or not that was the case for any of the things that I'm, vaguely referencing here. But sometimes they want a narrative out and that narrative proves to be untrue. So that's kind of how it is. And I've been fortunate to have some really good sources in some of my time when I would say from 16 through 18, I definitely would have called myself an insider. And then at 19, I kind of quit trying to do that, to be honest. So doesn't mean I don't still get some inside intel, right? Here and there. I still know people, but that knowing people doesn't necessarily mean that I'm asking for information. Wow, if you're watching, that was a weird head jerk I just did. Just basically hurt myself doing that. So, just to answer your question, that's how that tends to go. All right, that's going to do it for us today. We're going to be back on Thursday, likely with a mailbag. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. Peace.